I do not remember to have seen a handloom or a spinning wheel when in 1908 I described it in Hind Swaraj as the panacea for the growing pauperism of India. In that book, I took it as understood that anything that helped India to get rid of the grinding poverty of her masses would, in the same process, also establish Swaraj. Even in 1915, when I returned to India from South Africa, I had not actually seen a spinning wheel. When the Satyagraha ashram was founded at Sabarmati, we introduced a few handlooms there. But no sooner had we done this than we found ourselves up against a difficulty. All of us belonged either to the liberal professions or to business. Not one of us was an artisan. We needed a weaving expert to teach us to weave before we could work the looms. One was at last procured from Palanpur, but he did not communicate to us the whole of his art. But Maganlal Gandhi was not to be easily baffled. Possessed of a natural talent for mechanics, he was able fully to master the art before long, and one after another several new weavers were trained up in the ashram. The object that we set before ourselves was to be able to clothe ourselves entirely in cloth manufactured by our own hands. We therefore forthwith discarded the use of mill-woven cloth, and all the members of the ashram resolved to wear hand-woven cloth made from Indian yarn only. The adoption of this practice brought us a world of experience. It enabled us to know from direct contact the conditions of life among weavers, the extent of their production, the handicaps in the way of their obtaining their yarn supply, the way in which they were being made victims of fraud, and lastly, their ever-growing indebtedness. We were not in a position immediately to manufacture all the cloth for our needs. The alternative, therefore, was to get our cloth supply from handloom weavers. But ready-made cloth from Indian mill yarn was not easily obtainable either from the cloth dealers or from the weavers themselves. All the fine cloth woven by the weavers was from foreign yarn, since Indian mills did not spin fine counts. Even today, the outturn of higher counts by Indian mills is very limited, whilst the highest count they cannot spin at all. It was after the greatest effort that we were at last able to find some weavers who condescended to weave Swadeshi yarn for us, and only on condition that the ashram would take up all the cloth that they might produce. By thus adopting cloth woven from mill yarn as our wear and propagating it among our friends, we made ourselves voluntary agents of the Indian spinning mills. This in its turn brought us into contact with the mills and enabled us to know something about their management and their handicaps. We saw that the aim of the mills was more and more to weave the yarn spun by them. Their cooperation with the handloom weaver was not willing but unavoidable and temporary. We became impatient to be able to spin our own yarn. It was clear that until we could do this ourselves, dependence on the mills would remain. We did not feel that we could render any service to the country by continuing as agents of Indian spinning mills. No end of difficulties again faced us. We could get neither spinning wheel nor a spinner to teach us how to spin. We were employing some wheels for filling peons and bobbins for weaving in the ashram. But we had no idea that these could be used as spinning wheels. Once Kalidas Jhaveri discovered a woman who, he said, would demonstrate to us how spinning was done. We sent to her a member of the ashram who was known for his great versatility in learning new things. But even he returned without wresting the secret of the art. So the time passed on, and my impatience grew with the time. I plied every chance visitor to the ashram who was likely to possess some information about hand spinning with questions about the art. But the art being confined to women and having been all but exterminated, if there was one stray spinner still surviving in some obscure corner, only a member of that sex was likely to find out her whereabouts. In the year 1917, I was taken by my Gujarati friends to preside at the Broch Educational Conference. It was here that I discovered that remarkable lady, Ganga Behan Majmudar. She was a widow, but her enterprising spirit knew no bounds. Her education, in the accepted sense of the term, was not much, but in courage and common sense, she easily surpassed the general run of our educated women. She had already got rid of the curse of untouchability and fearlessly moved among and served the suppressed classes. She had means of her own, and her needs were few. She had a well-seasoned constitution and went about everywhere without an escort. She felt quite at home on horseback. I came to know her more intimately at the Godhra conference. To her I poured out my grief about the charka, and she lightened my burden by a promise to prosecute an earnest and incessant search for the spinning wheel. At last, after no end of wandering in Gujarat, Ganga Behan found the spinning wheel in Vijapur in the Baroda state. Quite a number of people there had spinning wheels in their homes, but had long since consigned them to the lofts as useless lumber. They expressed to Ganga Behan their readiness to resume spinning if someone promised to provide them with a regular supply of slivers and to buy the yarn spun by them. Ganga Behan communicated the joyful news to me. The providing of slivers was found to be a difficult task. On my mentioning the thing to the late Umar Sobani, he solved the difficulty by immediately undertaking to send a sufficient supply of slivers from his mill. I sent to Ganga Behan the slivers received from Umar Sobani, and soon yarn began to pour in at such a rate that it became quite a problem how to cope with it. Mr. Umar Sobani's generosity was great, but still one could not go on taking advantage of it forever. I felt ill at ease, continuously receiving slivers from him. Moreover, it seemed to me to be fundamentally wrong to use mill slivers. If one could use mill slivers, why not use mill yarn as well? Surely no mills supplied slivers to the ancients. How did they make their slivers then? With these thoughts in my mind, I suggested to Ganga Behan to find carders who could supply slivers. She confidently undertook the task. She engaged a carder who was prepared to card cotton. He demanded 35 rupees, if not much more, per month. I considered no price too high at the time. She trained a few youngsters to make slivers out of the carded cotton. I begged for cotton in Bombay. Sergeant Yashwant Prasad Desai at once responded. Ganga Behan's enterprise thus prospered beyond expectations. She found out weavers to weave the yarn that was spun in Vijapur, and soon Vijapur Khadi gained a name for itself. While these developments were taking place in Vijapur, the spinning wheel gained a rapid footing in the ashram. Maganlal Gandhi, by bringing to bear all his splendid mechanical talent on the wheel, made many improvements in it, and wheels and their accessories began to be manufactured at the ashram. The first piece of khadi manufactured in the ashram cost 17 annas per yard. I did not hesitate to commend this very coarse khadi at that rate to friends who willingly paid the price. I was laid up in bed at Bombay, but I was fit enough to make searches for the wheel there. At last I chanced upon two spinners. They charged 1 rupee for a seer of yarn, that is, 28 tolas or nearly 3/4 of a pound. I was then ignorant of the economics of khadi. I considered no price too high for securing hand-spun yarn. On comparing the rates paid by me with those paid in Vijapur, I found that I was being cheated. The spinners refused to agree to any reduction in their rates. So I had to dispense with their service. But they served their purpose. They taught spinning to Srimatis Avantika Bai, Rami Bai Kamdar, the widowed mother of Sergeant Shankarlal Banker, and Srimati Vasumati Behan. The wheel began merrily to hum in my room, and I may say without exaggeration that its hum had no small share in restoring me to health. I am prepared to admit that its effect was more psychological than physical. But then it only shows how powerfully the physical in man reacts to the psychological. I too set my hand to the wheel but did not do much with it at the time. In Bombay again, the same old problem of obtaining a supply of handmade slivers presented itself. A carder twanging his bow used to pass daily by Sergeant Reva Shankar's residence. I sent for him and learnt that he carded cotton for stuffing mattresses. He agreed to card cotton for slivers but demanded a stiff price for it, which however I paid. The yarn thus prepared I disposed of to some Vaishnava friends for making from it the garlands for the Pavitra Ekadashi. Sergeant Shivji started a spinning class in Bombay. All these experiments involved considerable expenditure, but it was willingly defrayed by patriotic friends, lovers of the motherland, who had faith in Khadi. The money thus spent, in my humble opinion, was not wasted. It brought us a rich store of experience and revealed to us the possibilities of the spinning wheel. I now grew impatient for the exclusive adoption of Khadi for my dress. My dhoti was still of Indian milk cloth. The coarse Khadi manufactured in the ashram and at Vijapur was only 30 inches in width. I gave notice to Ganga Behan that unless she provided with a Khadi dhoti of 45 inches within a month, I would do with the coarse, short Khadi dhoti. The ultimatum came upon her as a shock, but she proved equal to the demand made upon her. Well within the month, she sent me a pair of Khadi dhotis of 45 inches width and thus relieved me from what would then have been a difficult situation for me. At about the same time, Sergeant Lakshmi Das brought Sergeant Ramji, the weaver, with his wife Ganga Behan from Lathi to the ashram and got Khadi dhotis woven at the ashram. The part played by this couple in the spread of Khadi was by no means insignificant. They initiated a host of persons in Gujarat and also outside into the art of weaving hand-spun yarn. To see Ganga Behan at her loom is a stirring sight. When this unlettered but self-possessed sister plies at her loom, she becomes so lost in it that it is difficult to distract her attention and much more difficult to draw her eyes off her beloved loom. From its very inception, the Khadi movement, Swadeshi movement as it was then called, evoked much criticism from the mill owners. The late Umar Sobani, a capable mill owner himself, not only gave me the benefit of his own knowledge and experience, but kept me in touch with the opinion of the other mill owners as well. The argument advanced by one of these deeply impressed him. He pressed me to meet him. I agreed. Mr. Sobani arranged the interview. The mill owner opened the conversation. You know that there has been Swadeshi agitation before now? Yes, I do, I replied. You are also aware that in the days of the partition, we, the mill owners, fully exploited the Swadeshi movement. When it was at its height, we raised the prices of cloth and did even worse things. Yes, I have heard something about it, and it has grieved me. I can understand your grief, but I can see no ground for it. We are not conducting our business out of philanthropy. We do it for profit. We have got to satisfy the shareholders. The price of an article is governed by the demand for it. Who can check the law of demand and supply? The Bengalis should have known that their agitation was bound to send up the price of Swadeshi cloth by stimulating the demand for it. I interrupted. The Bengalis, like me, were trustful in their nature. They believed in the fullness of their faith that the mill owners would not be so utterly selfish and unpatriotic as to betray their country in the hour of its need, and even to go to the length, as they did, of fraudulently passing off foreign cloth as Swadeshi. I knew your believing nature, he rejoined. That is why I put to you the trouble of coming to me, so that I might warn you against falling into the same error as these simple-hearted Bengalis. With these words, The mill owner beckoned to his clerk, who was standing by, to produce samples of the stuff that was being manufactured in his mill. Pointing to it, he said, "Look at this stuff. This is the latest variety turned out by our mill. It is meeting with a widespread demand. We manufacture it from the waste. Naturally, therefore, it is cheap. We send it as far north as the valleys of the Himalayas. We have agencies all over the country, even in places where your voice or your agents can never reach. You can thus see that we do not stand in need of more agents. Besides, you ought to know that India's production of cloth falls far short of its requirements. The question of Swadeshi, therefore, largely resolves itself into one of production. The moment we can increase our production sufficiently and improve its quality to the necessary extent, the import of foreign cloth will automatically cease. My advice to you, therefore, is not to carry on your agitation on its present lines, but to turn your attention to the erection of fresh mills. What we need is not propaganda to inflate demand for our goods, but greater production." "Then surely you will bless my effort if I am already engaged in that very thing?" I asked. "How can that be?" he exclaimed, a bit puzzled. "But maybe you are thinking of promoting the establishment of new mills, in which case you certainly deserve to be congratulated." "I am not doing exactly that," I explained, "but I am engaged in the revival of the spinning wheel." "What is that?" he asked, feeling still more at sea. I told him all about the spinning wheel and the story of my long quest after it, and added, "I am entirely of your opinion. It is no use my becoming virtually an agent for the mills. That would do more harm than good to the country. Our mills will not be in want of custom for a long time to come. My work should be, and therefore is, to organize the production of hand-spun cloth and to find means for the disposal of the khadi thus produced. I am therefore concentrating my attention on the production of khadi. I swear by this form of Swadeshi, because through it I can provide work to the semi-starved, semi-employed women of India. My idea is to get these women to spin yarn and to clothe people of India with khadi woven out of it. I do not know how far this movement is going to succeed. At present it is only in the incipient stage, but I have full faith in it. At any rate, it can do no harm. On the contrary, to the extent that it can add to the cloth production of the country, be it ever so small, it will represent so much solid gain. You will thus perceive that my movement is free from the evils mentioned by you." He replied, "If you have additional production in view in organizing your movement, I have nothing to say against it. Whether the spinning wheel can make headway in this age of power machinery is another question. But I, for one, wish you every success." I must not devote any more chapters here to a description of the further progress of Khadi. It would be outside the scope of these chapters to give a history of my various activities after they came before the public eye, and I must not attempt it, if only because to do so would require a treatise on the subject. My object in writing these chapters is simply to describe how certain things, as it were, spontaneously presented themselves to me in the course of my experiments with truth. To resume then the story of the non-cooperation movement. Whilst the powerful Khilafat agitation set up by the Ali brothers was in full progress, I had long discussions on the subject with the late Maulana Abdul Bari and the other ulema, especially with regard to the extent to which a Mussulman could observe the rule of non-violence. In the end, they all agreed that Islam did not forbid its followers from following non-violence as a policy, and further that, while they were pledged to that policy, they were bound faithfully to carry it out. At last, the non-cooperation resolution was moved in the Khilafat conference and carried after prolonged deliberations. I have a vivid recollection how once at Allahabad a committee sat all night deliberating upon the subject. In the beginning, the late Hakim Sahib was skeptical as to the practicability of non-violent non-cooperation. But after his skepticism was overcome, he threw himself into it heart and soul, and his help proved invaluable to the movement. Next, the non-cooperation resolution was moved by me at the Gujarat political conference that was held shortly afterwards. The preliminary contention raised by the opposition was that it was not competent to a provincial conference to adopt a resolution in advance of the Congress. As against this, I suggested that the restriction could apply only to a backward movement, but as for going forward, the subordinate organizations were not only fully competent but were in duty bound to do so if they had in them the necessary grit and confidence. No permission, I argued, was needed to try to enhance the prestige of the parent institution, provided one did it at one's own risk. The proposition was then discussed on its merits, the debate being marked by its keenness no less than the atmosphere of sweet reasonableness in which it was conducted. On the ballot being taken, the resolution was declared carried by an overwhelming majority. The successful passage of the resolution was due not a little to the personality of Sergeant Vallabhbhai and Abbas Tyabji. The latter was the president, and his leanings were all in favor of the non-cooperation resolution. The All India Congress Committee resolved to hold a special session of the Congress in September 1920 at Calcutta to deliberate on this question. Preparations were made for it on a large scale. Lala Lajpat Rai was elected president. Congress and Khilafat specials were run to Calcutta from Bombay. At Calcutta, there was a mammoth gathering of delegates and visitors. At the request of Maulana Shaukat Ali, I prepared a draft of the non-cooperation resolution in the train. Up to this time, I had more or less avoided the use of the word non-violent in my drafts. I invariably made use of this word in my speeches. My vocabulary on the subject was still in process of formation. I found that I could not bring home my meaning to purely Muslim audiences with the help of the Sanskrit equivalent for non-violent. I therefore asked Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad to give me some other equivalent for it. He suggested the word Ba-Aman. Similarly, for non-cooperation, he suggested the phrase Tark-e-Mavalat. Thus, while I was still busy devising suitable Hindi, Gujarati and Urdu phraseology for non-cooperation, I was called upon to frame the non-cooperation resolution for that eventful Congress. In the original draft, the word non-violent had been left out by me. I had handed over the draft to Maulana Shaukat Ali, who was travelling in the same compartment, without noticing the omission. During the night, I discovered the error. In the morning, I sent Mahadev with the message that the omission should be made good before the draft was sent to the press. But I have an impression that the draft was printed before the insertion could be made. The subjects committee was to have met the same evening. I had therefore to make the necessary correction in the printed copies of the draft. I afterwards saw that there would have been great difficulty had I not been ready with my draft. Nonetheless, my plight was pitiable indeed. I was absolutely at sea as to who would support the resolution and who would oppose it. Nor had I any idea as to the attitude that Lalaji would adopt. I only saw an imposing phalanx of veteran warriors assembled for the fray at Calcutta. Dr. Besant, Pandit Malaviyaji, Sergeant Vijay Raghavachari, Pandit Motilalji, and the Deshabandhu being some of them. In my resolution, non-cooperation was postulated only with a view to obtaining redress of the Punjab and the Khilafat wrongs. That, however, did not appeal to Sergeant Vijay Raghavachari. If non-cooperation was to be declared, why should it be with reference to particular wrongs? The absence of a Swaraj was the biggest wrong that the country was labouring under. It should be against that non-cooperation should be directed, he argued. Pandit Motilalji also wanted the demand for Swaraj to be included in the resolution. I readily accepted the suggestion and incorporated the demand for Swaraj in my resolution, which was passed after an exhaustive, serious, and somewhat stormy discussion. Motilal ji was the first to join the movement. I still remember the sweet discussion that I had with him on the resolution. He suggested some changes in its phraseology, which I adopted. He undertook to win the Deshabandhu for the movement. The Deshabandhu's heart was inclined towards it, but he felt skeptical as to the capacity of the people to carry out the program. It was only at the Nagpur Congress that he and Lalaji accepted it wholeheartedly. I felt the loss of late Lokamanya very deeply at the special session. It has been my firm faith to this day that had the Lokamanya been then alive, he would have given his benedictions to me on that occasion. But even it had been otherwise and he had opposed the movement, I should still have esteemed his opposition as a privilege and an education for myself. We had our differences of opinion always, but they never led to bitterness. He always allowed me to believe that the ties between us were of the closest. Even as I write these lines, the circumstances of his death stand forth vividly before my mind's eye. It was about the hour of midnight, when Patwardhan, who was then working with me, conveyed over the telephone the news of his death. I was at that time surrounded by my companions. Spontaneously, the exclamation escaped my lips, "My strongest bulwark is gone." The non-cooperation movement was then in full swing, and I was eagerly looking forward to encouragement and inspiration from him. What his attitude would have been with regard to the final phase of non-cooperation will always be a matter of speculation and an idle one at that. But this much is certain, that the deep void left by his death weighed heavily upon everyone present at Calcutta. Everyone felt the absence of his counsels in that hour of crisis in the nation's history. The resolutions adopted at the Calcutta Special Session of the Congress were to be confirmed at its annual session at Nagpur. Here again, as at Calcutta, there was a great rush of visitors and delegates. The number of delegates in the Congress had not been limited yet. As a result, so far as I can remember, the figure on this occasion reached about 14,000. Lalaji pressed for a slight amendment to the clause about the boycott of schools, which I accepted. Similarly, some amendments were made at the instance of Deshabandhu, after which the non-cooperation resolution was passed unanimously. The resolution regarding the revision of the Congress Constitution too was to be taken up at this session of the Congress. The subcommittee's draft was presented at the Calcutta Special Session. The matter had therefore been thoroughly ventilated and thrashed out. At the Nagpur session, where it came up for final disposal, Sergeant C. Vijayaraghavachari was the president. The subjects committee passed the draft with only one important change. In my draft, the number of delegates had been fixed, I think, at 1,500. The subjects committee substituted in its place the figure 6,000. In my opinion, this increase was the result of hasty judgment, and experience of all these years has only confirmed me in my view. I hold it to be an utter delusion to believe that a large number of delegates is in any way a help to the better conduct of the business, or that it safeguards the principle of democracy. 1,500 delegates, jealous of the interests of the people, broad-minded and truthful, would any day be a better safeguard for democracy than 6,000 irresponsible men chosen anyhow. To safeguard democracy, the people must have a keen sense of independence, self-respect, and their oneness, and should insist upon choosing as their representatives only such persons as are good and true. But obsessed with the idea of numbers as the subjects committee was, it would have liked to go even beyond the figure of 6,000. The limit of 6,000 was therefore in the nature of a compromise. The question of the goal of the Congress formed a subject for keen discussion. In the constitution that I had presented, the goal of the Congress was the attainment of Swaraj, within the British Empire if possible, and without if necessary. A party in the Congress wanted to limit the goal to Swaraj within the British Empire only. Its viewpoint was put forth by Pandit Malaviyaji and Mr. Jinnah, but they were not able to get many votes. Again, the draft constitution provided that the means for the attainment were to be peaceful and legitimate. This condition too came in for opposition, it being contended that there should be no restriction upon the means to be adopted. But the Congress adopted the original draft after an instructive and frank discussion. I am of opinion that if this constitution had been worked out by the people honestly, intelligently, and zealously, it would have become a potent instrument of mass education, and the very process of working it out would have brought us Swaraj. But a discussion of the theme would be irrelevant here. Resolutions about Hindu-Muslim unity, the removal of untouchability, and Khadi too were passed in this Congress, and since then the Hindu members of the Congress have taken upon themselves the responsibility of ridding Hinduism of the curse of untouchability, and the Congress has established a living bond of relationship with the skeletons of India through Khadi. The adoption of non-cooperation for the sake of the Khilafat was itself a great practical attempt made by the Congress to bring about Hindu-Muslim unity. The time has now come to bring these chapters to a close. My life from this point onward has been so public that there is hardly anything about it that people do not know. Moreover, since 1921, I have worked in such close association with the Congress leaders that I can hardly describe any episode in my life since then without referring to my relations with them. For though Shraddhanandaji, the Deshbandhu, Hakim Saheb and Lalaji are no more with us today, we have the good luck to have a host of other veteran Congress leaders still living and working in our midst. The history of the Congress since the great changes in it that I have described above is still in the making, and my principal experiments during the past 7 years have all been made through the Congress. A reference to my relations with the leaders would therefore be unavoidable if I set about describing my experiments further. And this I may not do at any rate for the present, if only from a sense of propriety. Lastly, my conclusions from my current experiments can hardly as yet be regarded as decisive. It therefore seems to me to be my plain duty to close this narrative here. In fact, my pen instinctively refuses to proceed further. It is not without a wrench that I have to take leave of the reader. I set a high value on my experiments. I do not know whether I have been able to do justice to them. I can only say that I have spared no pains to give a faithful narrative. To describe truth as it has appeared to me and in the exact manner in which I have arrived at it has been my ceaseless effort. The exercise has given me ineffable mental peace because it has been my fond hope that it might bring faith in truth and ahimsa to waverers. My uniform experience has convinced me that there is no other God than truth. And if every page of these chapters does not proclaim to the reader that the only means for the realization of truth is ahimsa, I shall deem all my labor in writing these chapters to have been in vain. And even though my efforts in this behalf may prove fruitless, let the readers know that the vehicle, not the great principle, is at fault. After all, however sincere my strivings after ahimsa may have been, they have still been imperfect and inadequate. The little fleeting glimpses, therefore, that I have been able to have of truth can hardly convey an idea of the indescribable luster of truth, 1,000,000 times more intense than that of the sun we daily see with our eyes. In fact, what I have caught is only the faintest glimmer of that mighty effulgence. But this much I can say with assurance, as a result of all my experiments, that a perfect vision of truth can only follow a complete realization of ahimsa. To see the universal and all-pervading spirit of truth face to face, one must be able to love the meanest of creation as oneself. And a man who aspires after that cannot afford to keep out of any field of life. That is why my devotion to truth has drawn me into the field of politics. And I can say without the slightest hesitation, and yet in all humility, that those who say that religion has nothing to do with politics do not know what religion means. Identification with everything that lives is impossible without self purification. Without self purification, the observance of the law of ahimsa must remain an empty dream. God can never be realized by one who is not pure of heart. Self purification, therefore, must mean purification in all the walks of life. And purification being highly infectious, purification of oneself necessarily leads to the purification of one's surroundings. But the path of self purification is hard and steep. To attain to perfect purity, one has to become absolutely passion free in thought, speech, and action, to rise above the opposing currents of love and hatred, attachment and repulsion. I know that I have not in me as yet that triple purity in spite of constant ceaseless striving for it. That is why the world's praise fails to move me. Indeed, it very often stings me. To conquer the subtle passions seems to me to be harder far than the physical conquest of the world by the force of arms. Ever since my return to India, I have had experience of the dormant passions lying hidden within me. The knowledge of them has made me feel humiliated, though not defeated. The experiences and experiments have sustained me and given me great joy, but I know that I have still before me a difficult path to traverse. I must reduce myself to zero. So long as a man does not of his own free will put himself last among his fellow creatures, there is no salvation for him. Ahimsa is the farthest limit of humility. In bidding farewell to the reader, for the time being at any rate, I ask him to join with me in prayer to the God of truth, that he may grant me the boon of ahimsa in mind, word, and deed. End of The Story of My Experiments with Truth by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi.